Counselor had spent 400 years studying the Galactic Codex. She knew every word, every law, every truth written in its ancient pages. The Codex was the foundation of everything. It told every species in the Conquered how the universe worked, what was possible and what was not. No one questioned it. No one needed to. The Codex had stood unchanged for 12,000 years, and in all that time it had never been wrong. Was old now, even by standards. Her scales had faded from bright blue to a soft, and her movements were slower than they once were. But her mind remained sharp, and her devotion to the Codex had never wavered. She had trained hundreds of students, written dozens of commentaries, and defended the sacred text against every minor challenge that arose. She was, in many ways, the living guardian of galactic truth. So when the summons came from the High Council, she answered without hesitation. The council chamber was a vast circular room at the heart of the station. Representatives from the 12 founding species sat in their designated positions, their faces serious and their voices low, took her place among the advisors and waited for the session to begin. High Counselor, a towering figure with silver scales and ancient eyes, raised one hand for silence. The room fell quiet. "A new species has been discovered," announced. "They call themselves humans. They come from an unremarkable system on the edge of explored space." Felt a flicker of interest. Species were rare. Most sentient life evolved on gentle planets with stable climates and abundant resources, were places of extreme weather, dangerous predators, and constant struggle. The few species that emerged from such worlds were usually tough but primitive, taking centuries to adapt to galactic civilization. "Initial assessments show nothing remarkable," continued. "They have only recently developed faster-than-light travel. Their technology is crude by our standards. They appear to be a typical young species, curious but ignorant." Several council members nodded. This was a familiar story. New species joined the Conquered every few centuries. They learned the ways of galactic civilization, accepted the truths of the Codex, and eventually found their place in the natural order of things. "Counselor," said, turning to face her, "you will oversee the first contact process. Ensure that these humans understand our ways and accept our laws. This should be a simple matter." Bowed her head in acceptance. She had performed this duty many times before. Young species always had questions at first, but they always came to accept the Codex in the end. There was no other choice. The Codex was truth. 3 days later, the human ship arrived. Watched from the observation deck as the vessel docked with the station. It was a small ship, battered and from its journey through space. Compared to the elegant curves of Conquered vessels, it looked almost primitive, but there was something about it that caught her attention. The hull was covered in patches and repairs, evidence of damage that had been fixed again and again. This ship had been through hardship, and it had survived. The airlock opened, and the humans stepped out. There were 5 of them. Their leader was a female named Nora Bradley, a diplomat with calm eyes and a steady voice. Behind her stood a scientist named Shaw, a tall male with hair and an expression of barely contained excitement. The other 3 were assistants, younger humans who carried equipment and recording devices. Stepped forward to greet them. She had prepared a formal welcome speech, the same one she had given to dozens of new species over the centuries. But before she could speak, Ambassador Bradley smiled and extended her hand. "Thank you for receiving us," Bradley said. "We have so many questions." That was the first sign that something was different. In the days that followed, conducted the standard orientation. She explained the structure of the Conquered, the roles of the founding species, and the importance of the Galactic Codex. She described the natural order of things, the hierarchy of species, and the laws that governed interstellar civilization. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had delivered this information countless times. But the humans did not react like other species. They listened politely, but they kept interrupting with questions. Not simple questions for clarification, but deeper questions that challenged the very foundations of what was saying. Why is the hierarchy structured this way? Ambassador Bradley asked during one session. Blinked, because that is how it has always been. The Codex establishes the natural order based on each species' inherent characteristics. But who decided what those characteristics mean? Bradley pressed. Who determined that some traits are superior to others? The ancients who wrote the Codex answered. They studied the universe and recorded its truths. And no one has checked their work since then. The question hung in the air, felt a strange sensation, something she had not experienced in centuries. It took her a moment to recognize it as discomfort. The Codex does not need to be checked, she said finally. It is truth. Bradley nodded slowly, but her eyes held a look that could not quite read. It was not defiance or disrespect. It was something else, something that made uneasy. Meanwhile, Dr. Shaw had been given access to some of the station's public archives. He spent hours reading through scientific documents, asking questions of anyone who would speak with him. He was polite and friendly, but his questions were relentless. Why did the Conquered use this particular equation for faster-than-light calculations? Who had first discovered it? Had anyone ever tested it under different conditions? The station's scholars answered his questions with growing impatience. These were not matters for debate. The equations worked. The Codex said so. What more was there to discuss? On the seventh day, Ambassador Bradley requested a private meeting with. They sat together in study, surrounded by shelves filled with ancient texts and scholarly commentaries. I want to show you something, Bradley said. She pulled out a small data device and placed it on the table between them. This is a brief history of human knowledge. I thought it might help you understand us better. Accepted the device and began to read. At first, the content seemed unremarkable. The humans had developed their civilization through the usual stages, discovering fire, building cities, developing technology. But then she reached a section that made her stop. The humans called it the Scientific Revolution. It was a period in their history when they had deliberately destroyed their own established truths. They had questioned teachings that had stood for thousands of years. They had rejected the wisdom of their ancestors, tested everything they believed, and rebuilt their understanding of the universe from the ground up. They had done this on purpose. They had chosen uncertainty over certainty, questions over answers, doubt over faith. Set down the device. Her hands were trembling. You see knowledge differently than we do, Bradley said softly. For us, truth is not something you protect. It is something you test, and if it breaks, you find something stronger. Looked at the human sitting across from her. For 400 years, she had believed that the universe was a finished book, complete and perfect. Now, for the first time, she wondered if she had been reading it wrong all along. And that thought terrified her more than anything she had ever known. Did not sleep that night. She sat alone in her study, reading the human history files again and again. Each time she reached the section about their scientific revolution, she felt the same cold sensation spreading through her body. These creatures had looked at their most sacred beliefs and chosen to tear them apart. By morning, she had made a decision. The council needed to know what they were dealing with. The emergency session was held at midday, stood before the assembled representatives and presented her findings. She explained the human concept of scientific revolution. She described how they had overthrown established knowledge not once, but many times throughout their history. She showed them examples of human scholars who had been celebrated for proving their own teachers wrong. They do not accept truth because it comes from authority, concluded. They accept truth only after they have tried to destroy it and failed. This is fundamental to their nature. The council listened in silence. When finished, High Counselor leaned back in his seat and made a dismissive gesture with one hand. Every young species questions things, he said. It is part of their development. They challenge, they learn, and eventually they accept. The humans will be no different. With respect, High Counselor, I believe they are different, said. This is not youthful rebellion. This is their entire way of understanding reality. They have built their civilization on the principle that nothing is beyond question. A representative from the species, a creature with 4 arms and a face like polished stone, made a sound of amusement. And yet they have only just discovered faster-than-light travel. Their questioning has not served them well compared to our acceptance of proven truths. Several other council members murmured in agreement, felt frustration rising in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. I am not saying they are more advanced than us. I am saying they think in a way we have never encountered before. That could be dangerous. Or it could be harmless, replied. A cultural curiosity, nothing more. Continue with the orientation process, counselor. Help them understand our ways. They will adapt in time. Bowed and left the chamber. She knew the council was wrong, but she did not have the evidence to prove it yet. That evidence came sooner than she expected. Dr. Shaw had been spending his days in the station's scientific archives. He had been given access to basic materials only, the kind of introductory text that new species typically received. But Shaw had a talent for finding connections that others missed. On the 10th day of his research, he requested a meeting with the station's senior scientists. The request was granted more out of curiosity than respect. What could a human, a representative of a species that had barely mastered space travel, possibly have to say to scholars who had studied for centuries? Shaw stood before them in a small conference room. His posture was relaxed, and his voice was friendly. He did not seem to realize that most of the beings in the room considered him barely above a primitive. I have been reviewing your faster-than-light equations, Shaw began. The ones in the codex that govern how ships calculate jump distances. The senior scientists exchanged glances. These equations were fundamental to interstellar travel. They had been used without error for 8,000 years. I found a mistake, Shaw continued. The room went silent. It is in the 3rd variable set, Shaw explained. There is a calculation error that has been from the original work. The equations still function, but they are less efficient than they should be. Ships using these equations are burning about 12% more fuel than necessary. A scientist named rose to her feet. Her scales had turned dark red with anger. That is impossible. These equations have been used for thousands of years. If there was an error, someone would have found it. Has anyone ever checked? Shaw asked. His voice was gentle, not confrontational. We do not check the codex, replied. The codex is truth. Shaw tilted his head. But truth should be able to survive being checked, should it not? If the equations are correct, then testing them will only confirm it. And if they are wrong, would you not want to know? The silence that followed was heavy. Shaw reached into his bag and pulled out a data tablet. I have prepared corrected equations, he said. I would be happy to share them so that your scientists can verify my work. If I am wrong, you can show me where my error is. If I am right, you can improve your ships. He placed the tablet on the table and stepped back, waiting. No one moved to take it. Ambassador Bradley had warned Shaw that this might happen. She had spent enough time with to understand how deeply the conquered valued the unchanging nature of their knowledge. Still, she had hoped that evidence might be enough to open a door. Instead, the door slammed shut. Within hours of the meeting, word had spread throughout the station. The humans thought they knew better than the ancients. They had the arrogance to claim that the sacred codex contained errors. They were not humble newcomers seeking to learn. They were dangerous challengers trying to undermine the foundations of civilization. Conservative factions on the station began demanding action. The humans should be expelled before they could spread their corrupting influence. Their ideas were a threat to the stability of the conquered. Ambassador Bradley requested an audience with the High Council to address the accusations. She remained calm throughout the growing storm, meeting hostility with patience and anger with quiet reason. But privately, she was worried. The conquered was larger and more powerful than humanity. If they decided the humans were a threat, there would be little Earth could do. On the night before the scheduled hearing, received an unexpected visitor. Her name was, and she was one of the youngest scientists on the station. She was barely 100 years old, still in the early stages of her career. She had heard about Shaw's claims and, unlike her colleagues, she had actually looked at his corrected equations. "They work," said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I ran the calculations myself. His corrections make the equations more efficient." Stared at the young scientist. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone needs to know the truth." Scales had turned pale, a sign of fear. "I have had doubts before, counselor, questions that I was afraid to ask. When I heard what the human said, I thought maybe I was not alone." "You should be careful," warned. "Such thoughts can destroy a career." "I know," Met's eyes, "but I cannot stop wondering. If the humans are right about this equation, what else might they be right about? What else have we never questioned?" After left, sat alone in the darkness of her study. She thought about the 400 years she had spent defending the Codex. She thought about all the time she had dismissed questions without considering them. She thought about the certainty that had guided her entire life. And then she picked up Shaw's data tablet and began to read. The hearing chamber was filled beyond capacity. Representatives from every species on the station had come to witness the formal accusations against humanity. The air was thick with tension, and the mood was hostile. Most of those present had already decided that the humans were guilty of disrespect toward the Codex. Ambassador Nora Bradley stood alone in the center of the chamber. She wore her formal diplomatic uniform, and her expression was calm. Behind her, the rest of her team sat in the visitor section, their faces carefully neutral. High Counselor called the session to order. His voice echoed through the vast room. "Ambassador Bradley, you stand before this council to answer serious accusations. Your species has been on this station for less than one standard month, and in that time, you have shown contempt for our most sacred traditions. Your scientist has claimed that the Galactic Codex contains errors. This is not merely incorrect. It is an insult to 12,000 years of galactic civilization." Bradley listened without interrupting. When finished, she nodded respectfully. "May I speak, High Counselor?" Made a gesture of permission. Bradley took a slow breath and looked around the chamber. Her eyes moved from face to face, taking in the anger and suspicion that surrounded her. "I understand your concerns," she began. "You believe that we have shown disrespect for your traditions. You believe that we think we are superior to you. I want to assure you that neither of these things is true." A murmur of skepticism rippled through the crowd. "Dr. Shaw did not claim that the Codex contains errors because he wanted to insult you," Bradley continued. "He claimed it because he found evidence of errors and believed you would want to know. In human culture, finding mistakes is not an attack. It is a gift. It is an opportunity to improve." "The Codex does not need improvement," a council member interrupted. "It is the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years." "I do not doubt that," Bradley replied. "The Codex contains remarkable knowledge, but I have a question, and I hope you will consider it seriously." She paused, letting the silence build. "When was the last time you tested it?" The chamber went completely still. "Not read it," Bradley clarified. "Not studied it or taught it or memorized it. When was the last time anyone actually tested the claims in the Codex to see if they were still true?" No one answered. "The truth should not fear questions," Bradley said softly. "If the Codex is correct, then testing it will only prove its worth. And if parts of it are incorrect, would you not want to know? Would you not want the chance to make it better?" She reached into her uniform and pulled out a data tablet. "My team has spent the past 3 weeks reviewing sections of the Codex, not to attack it, but to understand it. We have found 17 significant errors, 42 assumptions that are no longer accurate based on current evidence, and 3 claims that are demonstrably false. The chamber erupted in outrage. Voices shouted over each other, demanding that Bradley be silenced. Some called for the humans to be arrested for blasphemy. Others simply stared in shock, unable to process what they were hearing. Raised his hand for silence. It took several minutes for the noise to die down. "You claim to have found errors in the codex," said, his voice cold. "Present your evidence." Bradley nodded and activated the data tablet. A holographic display appeared in the center of the chamber, showing equations, historical records, and scientific data. For the next hour, she walked through the evidence her team had collected. She was methodical and thorough, presenting each finding with supporting documentation. She did not gloat or mock. She simply laid out the facts and let them speak for themselves. When she finished, the chamber was silent. Bradley lowered the data tablet and looked at the council. "I'm not asking you to abandon the codex," she said. "I am asking you to strengthen it, remove the errors, update the assumptions, make it a living document that grows and improves rather than a frozen relic that slowly becomes less relevant. The knowledge in the codex is valuable, but knowledge that cannot be questioned is not truth. It is dogma." She stepped back and waited. The council members looked at each other, uncertain how to respond. For 12,000 years, no one had ever stood before them and challenged the codex with evidence. They had no procedure for handling such a situation because they had never imagined it could happen. Finally spoke. "We will take your claims under consideration," he said, his voice strained. "This session is adjourned." The crowd began to disperse, but the conversations that followed were different from before. Some still called for the humans to be expelled, but others were quieter, more thoughtful. A few even gathered in small groups to discuss what they had heard. That night sat alone in her quarters, staring at the walls. She had spent 400 years as a guardian of the codex. She had believed, truly believed, that she was protecting truth. And now, a young species from had stood before the council and shown that truth was not what she thought it was. The worst part was that she had already known. Shaw's corrected equations had worked. She had checked them herself. And once she had started questioning one part of the codex, she had found herself questioning others. There was a knock at her door. She opened it to find standing in the corridor, her scales pale with nervousness. "I watched the hearing," said. "The human ambassador was brave." "She was reckless," replied. "She may have destroyed any chance her species had of joining the conquered. Or she may have started something that needed to start." Hesitated, then continued. "I want to learn more about how humans think. Dr. Shaw has offered to teach anyone who wants to learn. He calls it the scientific method." "That would be career suicide," warned. "If you associate with the humans now, you will be marked as a traitor to the codex." Lifted her chin. "Maybe, but I cannot go back to pretending that I do not have questions. I have been silent for too long. I need to know the truth, even if it costs me everything." She turned and walked away, leaving alone with her thoughts. Closed her door and sat down heavily. She thought about her life, her work, her beliefs. She thought about the young scientist who was willing to risk everything for the chance to ask questions. And she thought about the choice that lay before her. She could stay silent and protect her position, or she could speak and possibly destroy everything she had built. For the first time in 400 years, did not know what the right answer was. But she knew she would have to find out. News of the hearing spread faster than anyone expected. Within days, reports had reached every corner of the conquered. The reactions were as varied as the species themselves. Some worlds erupted in outrage, demanding that the humans be expelled and their blasphemous claims destroyed. Others fell into confused silence, unsure how to process what had happened. And on a few worlds, mostly those populated by younger species, there were whispers of something that had not been heard in thousands of years. hope. On the station, the atmosphere had changed completely. The humans were no longer seen as harmless newcomers. They were seen as a threat to everything the conquered believed. Conservative factions held meetings and rallies, calling for immediate action. Moderate voices urged patience and further investigation. But beneath the surface arguments, something deeper was shifting. Questions that had been buried for generations were beginning to surface. Watched it all unfold from her quarters. She had stopped attending council sessions and had refused all requests for interviews. She needed time to think, to process what she had learned, and to decide what she was going to do. On the 14th day after the hearing, she made her decision. She called a public assembly in the station's central plaza. Word spread quickly, and by the time she arrived, thousands of beings had gathered to hear what the ancient counselor had to say. The crowd was a mix of species, ages, and opinions. Some had come hoping she would denounce the humans. Others had come hoping for something else entirely. Climbed the steps to the central platform. Her scales had faded to almost pure white with age, and her movements were slow. But her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. "I have served the Codex for 400 years," she began. "I have devoted my life to studying it, teaching it, and defending it. I believed with all my heart that I was protecting the truth." She paused and looked out at the crowd. "I was wrong." A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the assembly. "Not wrong about the value of the Codex," continued. "The knowledge it contains has guided our civilization for 12,000 years. That is not nothing. But I was wrong to believe that the Codex was perfect. I was wrong to believe that it could not be improved. And I was wrong to reject questions simply because they made me uncomfortable." She turned and gestured toward the area where the human delegation was standing. Ambassador Bradley watched with a neutral expression, but her eyes were alert. "These humans have done something that no species has done before. They have asked us to test our most sacred beliefs. They have challenged us to prove that what we believe is actually true, and I have decided to accept that challenge." The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Some cheered, others shouted in anger. A few simply stood in stunned silence. "I am announcing the formation of a new initiative," said, raising her voice above the noise. "I will work with the humans to review the Codex, not to destroy it, but to strengthen it. We will test its claims, correct its errors, and update its assumptions. We will create a version of the Codex that is not just ancient, but accurate." Before she could continue, a group of officials pushed through the crowd. At their head was Counselor, a hard-line conservative who had been calling for the humans' expulsion since the hearing. "Counselor," announced in a booming voice, "by your own words you have declared yourself a heretic. You have rejected the sacred truths of the Codex and aligned yourself with these alien. I hereby strip you of your rank, your titles, and your position in the scholarly order. You are no longer a counselor. You are nothing." Met his eyes without flinching. "I accept your judgment," she said quietly, "but I do not accept your authority to decide what is true and what is not. That authority belongs to evidence, not to rank." She turned back to the crowd. "Anyone who wishes to join me is welcome. I do not promise safety or comfort. I only promise the chance to ask questions and seek honest answers." For a long moment no one moved. Then a figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was the young scientist who had come to quarters weeks earlier. Her scales were pale with fear, but her steps were steady. "I will join you," said. Another figure emerged from the crowd, then another, and another. Within minutes, more than 100 beings had gathered around, representing nearly a dozen species. They were mostly young, but not all. Some were scientists. Others were teachers, engineers, or simple citizens who had always wondered but never dared to ask. Watched with growing fury. "You are all making a terrible mistake," he warned. "The Codex is the foundation of our civilization. Without it, everything will collapse." Dr. Shaw stepped forward and addressed the crowd directly. On Earth, we once believed that too, he said. We had our own sacred texts, our own unchanging truths. We thought that questioning them would destroy us. But we questioned them anyway, and do you know what happened? We did not fall apart. We grew. We learned. We built a civilization that could reach the stars. He spread his hands. Questions are not the enemy of truth. They are the tools we use to find it. Opened his mouth to respond, but he was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the plaza. A group of station security officers had arrived, apparently intending to arrest the humans, but they found their path blocked by the beings who had joined the initiative. The officers hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Ambassador Bradley stepped forward. "We do not want conflict," she said calmly. "We only want the chance to work with those who share our curiosity. If the conquered wishes us to leave, we will leave. But we will not stop asking questions. That is not who we are." The standoff lasted for several tense minutes. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out, "Let them stay." Other voices joined in. Not everyone, but enough. The security officers looked to for guidance, but he had no answer. The situation had spiraled beyond his control. That night, and her followers, along with the human team, gathered in a small meeting room to begin their work. They called themselves the Seekers, and their goal was simple: test everything, question everything, accept only what could be proven. As they settled into their seats, Ambassador Bradley received a message from Earth. She read it, then looked up with a small smile. "Humanity has been watching," she said. "They are sending more ships, more scientists, more teachers." She met eyes. "We are just getting started." 1 year had passed since the day stood in the plaza and declared herself a seeker of truth. In that time, the galaxy had changed more than it had in the previous 1,000 years. The conquered still existed, but it was no longer the same institution. The old certainties had crumbled, replaced by something messier but more alive. The Galactic Codex, once considered sacred and unchangeable, had been officially retired. In its place stood a new document called the Living Archive. Unlike the Codex, the archive was designed to grow and change. Every claim it contained was marked with a confidence level based on the evidence supporting it. Every entry included instructions for how to test it, and what would count as proof that it was wrong. The conservatives had fought against this change with everything they had. For months, the conquered had teetered on the edge of civil war. But in the end, the movement started by, and the humans had proven too strong to stop. Species after species had joined the Seekers, drawn by the promise of a new way of understanding the universe. Herself had become one of the most famous beings in the galaxy. She had gone from respected scholar to condemned heretic to revolutionary leader in less than a year. Now she served as the first director of the Living Archive, overseeing a staff of thousands from more than 30 species. Her quarters were filled with messages of gratitude, requests for advice, and invitations to speak at universities and assemblies across known space. But she still found time for the work that mattered most. This morning, she stood in the archive's main research chamber, watching a team of young scientists run experiments on a set of equations that had been accepted as truth for 6,000 years. The equations governed energy transfer in ship reactors. They had always worked, but no one had ever asked if they could work better. Dr. Shaw stood beside her, his hair now completely white. He had aged noticeably in the past year, but his eyes still held the same eager curiosity they had shown on the day he first arrived at the station. "They are making progress," Shaw said, nodding toward the young researchers. "Another few weeks and they should have the improved equations ready for testing." Watch the teamwork. Among them was no longer a nervous junior scientist but a confident researcher who had published more papers in the past year than most scholars produced in a lifetime. "You have changed everything," said quietly. Shaw shook his head. "We only asked questions. You and the others did the hard work of finding answers." A chime sounded. indicating an incoming message. Checked her communicator and found a notice that Ambassador Bradley's ship would be departing the station within the hour. The ambassador was finally returning to Earth after a year of diplomatic work that had reshaped galactic civilization. "We should go say goodbye," said. They made their way to the docking bay, where a small crowd had already gathered. Representatives from dozens of species had come to see the human diplomat off. Bradley stood at the foot of her ship's boarding ramp, shaking hands and exchanging final words with those who had come to know her over the past year. When she saw approaching, Bradley smiled warmly. "Director," she said, "I was hoping you would come." "I would not miss it," replied. "You have earned a proper farewell." Bradley looked around at the diverse crowd that surrounded them. Her expression was thoughtful. "When we first arrived here, I was not sure we would survive a month," she admitted. "Your civilization was so certain, so established. I thought our questions would be crushed before they could take root." "They nearly were," acknowledged. "But you planted them in fertile ground. There were many of us who had doubts, even if we were afraid to speak them. You gave us permission to wonder." Bradley reached out and clasped hands in the human gesture of friendship. "Take care of what we have built together," she said. "The living archive is more than a document. It is a promise that knowledge will keep growing, that questions will always be welcome, that the truth is strong enough to survive being tested." "I will," promised. Bradley turned to address the gathered crowd one final time. Her voice carried across the docking bay, reaching every being present. "I want to tell you something about my species," she said. "Humanity has not always been wise. We have made terrible mistakes. We have started wars over ideas and killed each other over beliefs. We have clung to false truths and punished those who questioned them." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But we learned. Slowly, painfully, we learned that the universe does not care what we believe. It only cares what is true. And the only way to find the truth is to keep asking questions, even when the answers are uncomfortable, even when they shatter everything we thought we knew." She smiled. "You are learning that lesson too, faster than we ever did. In a single year, you have done what took humanity centuries. That gives me hope for the future." She turned and walked up the boarding ramp. At the top, she looked back one final time and raised her hand in farewell. Then she disappeared into the ship, and the ramp closed behind her. The crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their duties and their lives. But the moment stayed with them. The humans had come as strangers and left as teachers. They had shattered certainties and built something new in their place. That evening gave a lecture to a new class of seekers. They were young, barely out of their training, and they looked at her with a mixture of awe and eagerness. She remembered feeling the same way once, centuries ago, when she had believed that the universe was a finished puzzle waiting to be understood. "I want to tell you what the humans taught us," began. "They did not give us new answers. They gave us something far more valuable. They gave us permission to ask new questions." She looked out at the faces before her, dozens of species united by curiosity rather than obedience. "For 12,000 years, we believed that the universe was a finished book, complete and perfect. We thought our job was to read it and memorize it and protect it from those who might damage its pages. We were wrong." She spread her hands. "The universe is not a book. It is a story that is still being written. Every discovery adds a new chapter. Every question opens a new page. And every species, including those strange, stubborn, brilliant humans, is holding the pen." She smiled, an expression she had learned from Ambassador Bradley. "Now it is our turn to write. Let us make it a story worth telling." The lecture ended, and the young seekers filed out to begin their work. Remained behind, looking out the window at the stars. Somewhere out there, a small human ship was carrying Ambassador Bradley home. And somewhere else, more human ships were on their way, bringing more questions, more challenges, more chances to grow. The galaxy would never be the same. The old certainties were gone forever. And former guardian of unchanging truth had never been happier.